I'm Dr. Lisa Steiner. I am the leader of Wellsprings Counseling Center and Wellsprings Coaching Services. I'm going to cover some of the important statistics, explain what is mental health, then go through where does the mind fit into the overall person. You know, we're talking about a healthy mind. And what does that actually mean? And how do we help ensure that we have a healthy mind? And how important is your mind in your overall well-being? Then I'm going to talk about what precedes human behavior. Lots of times in life, we judge or assess a situation based on how somebody's acting. But before they behave, there's usually feelings, which are fuel, and there are thoughts. And there's usually a trigger event. And I want to explain that process because with that insight, that can help you even analyze some of your own situations and think about, wow, why am I upset right now? Why am I acting this way? What's going underneath it? Why is a family member acting in a certain way? So I'm going to focus on the thought life, talk about the emotions as well, and then talk about where do you get help? Did you know these certain things about mental health? 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness. So if it's not you that's dealing with it, you might be dealing with a family member, a friend, a team member who is dealing with something emotionally or mentally related. So I put some numbers on the screen to show how staggering these numbers are. And I laid them out by the top 4 diagnoses in terms of the number of people in the US that struggle with this mental disorder. Anxiety, 48 million people deal with anxiety. Now we know there's day-to-day, everyday stress that you might go through, and there might be certain times, like for example, if you're trying to drive here and you're a little bit late, right? You might be a little bit anxious. But there are a lot of people that day in and day out affected by anxiety. Major depression, almost 18 million people. Post-traumatic stress disorder, 9 million. And then bipolar, 7 million. That's a lot. And if you look at the impact within the family, the ripple effect is 8.4 million people in the US are dealing with a family member that's struggling with a mental illness. And you know how many hours a week they're spending on tending to that person? It's almost a full-time job, about 32 hours a week of unpaid care. That's a lot. Now, many years ago, there weren't as many interventions for mental illness as there are today. Actually, in the 50s and the 60s, there wasn't much knowledge about how do you treat it other than maybe you heard as a kid or your mother told you about, you know, Uncle so-and-so was sent off somewhere. Since then, there has been so much advancements in technology and in medication and an understanding of ways to help those dealing with mental illness. So it's not like before that they're not treatable. They are treatable. So don't be frightened by the numbers because there are solid treatment plans that are out there. So what is mental health? It has to do with how we think, how we feel, and then how we act. And again, behavior, the action is the exterior. But underneath that, there's other things that are going on. It also helps determine how we handle stress, right? Think about it in your jobs. You're dealing with a lot of stress, right? There's only 168 hours in each week. So if you're working full-time jobs, 40 plus hours, you're spending a lot of time at work. And just we know, especially in the area we live in the New York, New Jersey area, there's so much stress. And so it helps you handle stress, relate to others. How do you interact with your team members? How do you interact with your significant others? And then it's about how you make choices. Because if you're struggling with something, it's hard to make choices or know what's the right choice to make when you feel down and out. And sometimes you might need somebody to come alongside of you and walk you through it. And at Wellsprings, I have a team of 20 licensed counselors and professional coaches as well. And we've been trained to come alongside individuals to help them overcome life situations. So let me talk about where does the mind fit into the whole body? Because today's presentation is to focus on, you know, your mind, the healthy mind, yours and your loved ones. So let's talk about the whole person. And so we think about the whole person, there's 3 parts. There's our body, right? Our physical body. There's our soul, which is where our mental health is housed. It's our mind, it's our emotions, it's our will, our choices. But there's also a spiritual side. In the United States, 80–90% of the people believe in some type of spirituality. It doesn't mean to be a specific religion. Just in general, that there's something that transcends or something that's much higher. Sometimes you could be dealing with a life issue and you have to think about, how's it affecting me on these three realms? Because one of these three realms can be used, or a combination thereof, to bring about total healing. I had a situation with my son in the beginning of the school year where the nurse called me, they called the ER, his heart rate was really high, and there's a little concern what was going on with him. And I assessed the situation from the three realms. And so, yeah, we brought him to the pediatrician, we brought him to a cardiologist. I also knew from a mental health standpoint, it probably was some type of anxiety. But because I know that there's a three-part side of us, I had to first rule out physical. I also had to consider the spiritual. Was there something going on there? And then I focused in the soul realm, and it turned out to be separation anxiety that had resurfaced. So the mind comes within your soul realm. And so now I want to pull apart what happens. Why do we behave the way that we do? What precedes it? And so I love to draw this chart. I often do it with clients as well, to say, what's preceding that behavior? So maybe you don't like how you're interacting or how your significant other is interacting with you and you don't understand what's going on. I want you to try and get underneath the covers. If we have an issue with our car, we have to get underneath the covers of it. So usually in life, our behavior comes after we're feeling something. Feelings are our fuel. It's what makes us act. But before our feeling is usually some type of thought. And before that thought is a trigger event. So, for example, for me this morning, even though I was close in the area, my GPS, I had the wrong thing plugged into it, or really I thought it was the right thing and it was hard to read it. And all of a sudden I had the thought, uh-oh, I might be late. Well, do you know, I started to feel my heart race a little bit, right? I started to feel it in my body. And then I started to panic a little bit to say, okay, maybe I have to speed up, start to panic. And so I want you to think about, before the behavior, before the action is usually some type of fuel, your feelings, your emotions. Lots of times we take a look at, oh, I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling sad. But I always tell clients, let's get underneath it. Well, what have you been thinking about? What's been your self-talk? And so our thought life is so important. And so that's what I want to focus on today. Our thought life, our beliefs, our self-scripts that are then generating the fuel, which is your feelings, which then generates your behavior. And so let's talk about your thought life. Current research supports that 87% of illness is caused by our thought life. What have we been thinking about? Do we have stinking thinking? Or are we having good thinking? What's going on in our minds? What are we meditating on? And so then 13% is attributed to diet, genetics, and environment. So I know there were some questions up front about nutrition. Yes, that comes into play, and that is important. But something more important is, what are you thinking about? And no one else knows what you're thinking about. Maybe somebody who's close to you can read your body language and say, I know what he or she is thinking about. But you're the one who knows what's going on in your mind. And so I want you to pay attention to that. So let's give an example of a trigger for somebody and how somebody could react one way and somebody another way, but it all goes back to the thought life. So I'm going to use a sales team example. Let's say a guest cancels a large order. You just have this great order in, you're counting on these commissions that are going to come in, and all of a sudden a guest cancels a large order. Now, how could that person, what could they be thinking based on that? Something negative could be, I'm a terrible salesperson. Now imagine that event, that trigger event, somebody cancels a large order thinking, I'm a terrible salesperson. Anybody who meditates on, I'm a terrible person, how are they going to feel? Is it going to be positive? It's going to be negative. Then that's negative fuel. And then that negative fuel is going to result in some negative behavior. So in this example, it would bring about a lot of discouragement. Maybe somebody feels like they want to throw in the towel and they want to give up versus moving forward. But let's take that same example, the same trigger event, the same trigger. Somebody who deals with it could just say, hey, that's just a part of life or business. That happens. Let me just move past this. Let me move forward. Then at least their emotion, their fuel, is going to be neutral to somewhat positive versus being totally negative. Now we have to make sure, because sometimes we have, we might be trying to think about something positive that's not realistic. We have to also ground it in some type of objective truth. For example, if you thought, I'm the best, I can fly, and you step out of a 10-story building, I'm sorry, the law of gravity is going to kick in and it's going to be splat, right? So your thought life isn't going to overcome everything. You need to make sure it's grounded in some type of objective truth and something that's realistic and positive. But there are ways to respond. Somebody, let's say, loses their job. They could be saying, wow, this is terrible, I'll never find another job, and then they feel awful. Or they can say, you know what, there might be a silver lining in this cloud. Let me look for that silver lining. And let me see, maybe I can now use this as an opportunity for, something in their life. In counseling, this is one of the theories, we call it cognitive behavioral therapy. We're trying to get underneath, somebody who has insight to get underneath what's really going on. Because if you can change the way you think about a situation, you can have a much more positive life. Okay, so what's a part of our thought life? Our self-esteem, what we're thinking about, is based off of our thought life. Unfortunately, many of us grew up in homes where maybe our parents spoke to us in some ways, like, you're a loser, you're never going to amount to anything. Somebody who meditates on that, what's going to result? They're going to feel terrible, their self-esteem is going to be low. Versus somebody who grew up in a family, you can overcome, you can do it, keep moving forward. That person is going to have much more positive self-esteem. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the thought life, our thought life about ourselves. Before we can focus on another person, relationships are between you and someone else. So let's first focus on the me part of the relationship before we can focus on the other. And I am going to talk about the other as well, but let's talk about the me part of it. What's happening in me? So one potential way to handle it, and we might encourage clients to think about what are your thoughts, and one way is to kind of visualize a stop sign to say, stop thinking so negatively. There's some people in your life you might think about, they're always pessimistic. They always see the glass as half empty. And there's some other who always see the glass as half full. So you want to capture what's going on in your thought life. You want to cast that thought down. You want to take it captive. And one way to do it is just to visualize a stop sign when you start meditating on something so negative, and then just visualize a stop sign to take that thought captive and cast it down. So, and then replace it with a positive self-script, something that might be self-affirming. That's where oftentimes we find people who might even turn to their faith. They might turn to maybe a book that's a part of their faith, whether it's the Torah or scriptures or it's the Quran, whatever it is, they might turn to have some type of meditations to say, well, what does my God say about me? I am an overcomer. Some positive things to meditate on, because maybe that person never heard anything positive growing up. Maybe they never heard a positive thing from their parents, their siblings, their teachers. And so they need to turn to even a higher power to say, what do you really think about me? How do you feel about me? So as we think about your thought life in the self-scripts, I'm going to talk about self-scripts in 3 flavors. You think about what I am, right? Which is who you think you are. I can, which is about your ability. And then I will, which is about your motivation. So as you think about some of your self-scripts, to focus on, what are you saying about who you are? I am what? And if it's something negative, you got to change that. It's going to be important, because it's just going to lead to negative fuel, which is going to lead to negative behavior. Number 2 is going to be, I can do all things. I can accomplish. It's about your ability. And then there's I will, which is your motivation. I will do this today. I will overcome this. I will overcome this challenge. I will move forward. I will survive, right? That song, I will survive. You know, how you're going to, and actually I like to say instead of survive, I will thrive. Because surviving is just so-so, right? But I will thrive. I will move forward in boldness. So I mentioned about the self, right? I want to focus a little bit on our emotions and our heart because the thoughts come usually first. Now sometimes there's triggers in life that it bypasses our thoughts. It goes straight to our feelings and our body sensations. We often see that in somebody who had maybe some past trauma, that the thought, they can't even focus on what they're thinking about. It just goes straight to a familiar feeling, and maybe they feel fear and they can't even get underneath why they're feeling the fear. And it goes straight to that feeling. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of emotional boundaries, of guarding our heart. I'm going to talk more about our interpersonal skills, how we relate to others. And I'm even going to briefly talk about the topic of forgiveness and how can we move forward, because sometimes we're holding on to unforgiveness and that keeps us anchored in negativity. We're not forgiving for the other person. We need to forgive to clean up our own hearts. So I love this chart that just shows a picture of a heart, right? And I show a little bit like of a boundary around it. There's a great book, and I have a resources, which is the last page, by two psychologists called Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And the book is called Boundaries. And they give a great analogy to compare to your heart. So let's say you own a home and you have a backyard, but you don't have a fence up yet. And you notice that the neighbor on one side, who's good friends with the neighbor catty corner on the other side, keeps walking across your backyard. The grass you've planted is turning brown. Your tulips, which are my favorite flower, but somebody else's, whatever the favorite flower you have, your tulips are being trampled on. And you're like, yikes, I'm paying property taxes on it. And this neighbor disrespects my backyard. So then you decide to put up a fence. Now, I didn't say a wall. Sometimes people do put up walls, but a fence that has a gate, because you say, wow, there's some friends I want to let into my backyard and hang out there that have respect for my grass and respect my tulips, and they're going to be sensitive to my backyard that I pay property taxes on it. Well, that's the analogy to our heart. Who are we letting trample on our hearts? Do we have a fence up and are careful who we let into our hearts? Now, with cell phones and social media, like I know with texting, sometimes you get these intrusive texts. I don't know about you, but does anybody have some dysfunctional family members and you just maybe had at Thanksgiving or Christmas, right? And you're like, oh my. And then occasionally you get texts from them and it's like things that it's like, oh, it's so intrusive. It comes as direct access to your heart. Well, maybe you need to put some boundaries up. Maybe you need to not, when somebody calls you, pick up the phone immediately because you feel out of obligation. If I don't pick up the phone, they're going to be mad at me. Like they own your heart. Like they own your time. Your heart is your heart and you need to protect it. And you need to have some boundaries. And lots of times we see those who come into counseling, oftentimes it's because they're letting people trample on their heart. And they're starting to believe the scripts of those other people about their lives. And they need to put a fence up. And then only letting people into the backyard are going to help tend to their backyard, tend to their heart. So my question for you, who or what are you letting have access to your emotions? I actually quote a scripture from Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for it's the wellspring of life. That was one of the foundational scriptures for the name Wellsprings. Wellsprings Counseling Center, then Wellsprings Coaching Services is based on that. We need to guard our heart. And we can do that, but we often don't learn about it as kids, right? And so it's something maybe to learn as an adult. The next thing I want to focus on, because I've been focusing mostly on the me, on where we are. But we have to relate with other people, right? Sometimes in life, don't you wish you were on a deserted island all by yourself and just everybody would be gone? my kids are still young at that point where sometimes it's like, oh, I wish Calgon take me away. I want to get away from them, get away from everybody. Everybody leave me alone, right? But I have to deal with people on a day-to-day basis, right? Because we're not on some deserted island. Sometimes we are in bed and we want to pull the covers over our head and we feel like, okay, we're away from, everybody, but we have to deal with people on a day-to-day basis. So I want to talk about something called our interpersonal approaches. How are we with others and how are others with us? To pay attention to other people's interpersonal styles that might be a part of what's triggering you, and to pay attention where you are versus them. So I want to talk about, do you ever take geometry, the x-axis and the y-axis? Well, your y-axis on this one, the one going up and down, the vertical line is what's somebody's consideration for their self needs. And that horizontal line is their consideration for others' needs. So you have to balance the two. And the healthy interpersonal style is somebody who has a high consideration for self and a high consideration for others. But oftentimes we see the imbalance. We see somebody that has the high consideration for others and low for self. They're usually passive. I have a little picture of a doormat. You feel like a doormat. People are stepping all over you. If you find that's in your interpersonal style, the good news is you have a high consideration for others. We just have to get you up to have as much of this consideration for yourself. Then there's the other side of somebody who has a high consideration for self and low for others. They're usually aggressive. They're the steamrollers, right? Now, I hate to say it, I've been accused of being a steamroller. I've had to tone that down. I more naturally was that, still am at times. People who work for me can say, ouch, ouch, yes. But I'm trying to pull that back. And I had to say, okay, how do I balance that? How do I make sure I have that same level of consideration for others and self and keep that well in balance? The good news is I had a high consideration for self. I just have to make sure I have an equally considerate side for others. So assertive is the goal. The one that's at the bottom left-hand corner, they have usually low consideration for self and others, low self-esteem, low regard for others. They're usually passive-aggressive. They get back at you in indirect ways. I give an example, let's say husband and wife example. The wife's upset at the husband, but she makes his favorite meal, but she burns it. Oh, sorry, burned it. Right? There's times in our life we've experienced others who have done that, like, you feel that? And you're like, but they have a smile on their face. It's like their nice smile on their face, but there's war in the heart. And that's more the passive aggressive that you see. So think about your own style. You can't change others, but think about where you're at. And if you're finding yourself low on one of those, how do you work to elevate that? How do you get that other side up? And so the last big concepts I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about where to get help, is I want to talk about forgiveness for a few minutes. And I remember the concept of forgiveness, and I would hear that word, and I'm like, how could you forgive somebody who hurt you so deeply? And there's a great video clip from a professor at UCLA, Stephen Marmer is his name, and I have the link, and I have it in the reference source section. It's a little 5-minute video clip I send to a lot of clients on forgiveness. And he explains 3 types of forgiveness. He talks about, number 1 is exoneration. You restore the person to where they were before. So let's say it happens with one of my children. They do something that's really a little bit annoying. After we resolve it, I have to restore them. I mean, they're learning, they're in process, or even with my husband, to eventually exonerate him or her back to the position they were at, because it's a significant relationship and they know how to take ownership. And by the way, we can help ensure someone takes ownership. Like, I've helped with my husband teach him how to take ownership when he didn't want to, or my kids as well. Because I'm like, wait a second, I'm the one left with a lot of hurt and pain. Let's look at it. Because sometimes people treat us the way we allow them to treat us. So exoneration, be careful. There's some people who exonerate a person before they fully taken ownership for how they've really trampled on your heart. But the second one, let's say it's a person who says they've taken ownership, and you're not really sure. You need to go in that relationship with forbearance, a guarded heart. You're not quite yet sure if you can restore them to let them in and out of your backyard, right? You're not quite sure if you can do that yet. So what you end up doing is you're a little bit guarded. Maybe you let them in the backyard a little bit, see how they are. Are they nice now, more sensitive around the grass and the tulips? And if they are, then eventually maybe you can elevate them to exoneration. But what do you do with a person that takes no ownership? The no stick person, never apologizes, never takes ownership. And I know the focus is more because if they take ownership, they'll learn from it and they'll try not to do it again. You know, there's actually 5 apology languages they talk about. Somebody hears, I'm sorry, or please forgive me, or I was wrong, I'll try not to do it again, or what can I do to make it right? So it's the person who says, please forgive me, I was wrong, I'll try not to do it again, or what can I do to make it right? Somebody can't promise that they'll never do it again because we're fallen humans and we're going to make mistakes. So it might be, you know, what could I do? But this is a person who takes no ownership. It's like it's all you, it's not me. At that point, you need to release the person. Release them from your heart, your mind, and then when you do, you can feel some relief. And so it might be a family member that, hey, you'll be cordial to at family events, but in many ways in your heart and mind, you've just released them because you can't cope with, they keep trampling on your backyard and then say, I didn't do that. And after a while, you're like, this is the only heart I have, and I have to guard it. It's about where do you get help? You have to first assess what's the severity of the situation. So I want to start with the worst severity, which is crisis, which is a life and death situation. And unfortunately, today there has been a rise in suicides, right? That we have to, and even homicides, you know, we have to be sensitive to where is this person? So if somebody is talking about taking their life, and I'll show you a chart in a few minutes that gives a little more information, then you need a crisis intervention immediately. And so there are suicide hotlines I'll talk about, and mobile crisis units. And then let's say it's something not as crisis. There are practices like Wellsprings Counseling Center, Wellsprings Coaching Services that you could take advantage of. So the next slide talks about the suicide hotline, 1-800-273-TALK. There's also the chat line. So if you're concerned about a family member or even yourself, there's 24/7 availability because we don't want somebody to take their life. And we do have to pay attention to what the person is saying. There's the chat I mentioned as well, and it's for somebody in distress. Here are some suicide warning signs. You pay attention to the talk of the person. Are they talking dark thoughts? Because out of the abundance of our heart, our mouth speaks. So if they're saying, hey, you know, this life isn't worth living, I wish I weren't alive, pay attention. Now you might be thinking, oh, that person just wants attention. Maybe that person needs attention, but maybe they need professional attention because as a family member, that's too heavy for you to carry the situation. Look at their mood. Are they depressed? Have they lost interest? Are they irritable? And then their behavior. And so the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, afsp.org, is a great resource. The mobile crisis unit, they actually, you do a search of your county and put mobile crisis in it. I did it for Middlesex County. Rutgers Health, University Behavioral Health, they have a 24-hour phone and walk-in service. Their walk-in service is in Piscataway. So let's say there was somebody you were concerned about, you can just bring them over to Piscataway, or you can call them and say, hey, I'm concerned about my loved one, my family member, based on what they're saying. And they'll give you guidance and they'll tell you the local resources. Here's an 800 number that you can call as well. You can just look at our website, wellsprings.org, and you can see the coaching, or you can email coaching@wellsprings.org, or you can call us at 201-956-6299 extension 20. And we'll have a new client coordinator that will guide the process and help you through. If counseling, I give the phone number for counseling. So some of you might be thinking, well, what's counseling versus coaching? There's a great chart. It was actually in a PhD class I took on coaching. And this Dr. Collins, his name was, who was the professor who's written books on coaching and on counseling as well. is to think about a person's life from -10 to +10, where 0 is in the middle. So somebody who feels they're at a -10 in their life is very dysfunctional. And it might be a slice of their life. It might be in their marriage. They feel a -10. It might be in their health. Whatever area, they're feeling very dysfunctional. And so counseling usually helps bring somebody to dysfunctional to functional, where the drive isn't really to optimal, because there's just so many things you can do to get that person where they feel steady and they can function at work, they can function at home. But there are, counselors, we can bring them to optimal as well. But coaching more focuses on bringing somebody who's functional or maybe just a little dysfunctional to optimal, to that purpose-driven life. And so the first one, counseling, is based in more like the abnormal psychology or restorative psychology movement, while coaching is more based on positive psychology. So I have certified coaches who can help you move from where you are now to where you want to be and come up with an action step and a plan. When somebody's really, really dysfunctional in an area, it's hard for them to even say and come up with an action plan because they feel so down and out. And that's where they might need a counselor just to help them get to a more functional state. So what I covered today in the presentation part, I covered the important statistics, right? We talked about what mental health is. We talked about where mental health fits into the whole person, where the mind fits in. We talked about like 87% of illnesses can be attributed back to the thought life, which says this is important. And then I gave you some ideas about, okay, how do you look at your thought life? When you think about what you are, your self-esteem, I am, I can, and I will. How do you guard your heart? What's your interpersonal style? And then how do I at times have to forgive, which might even include just release a person because it's trampled too much on my heart. And then I talked about where to get help.